Before we begin, I am so delighted to be able to announce to you next year's Simpson Lecture, and you can tell your friends you were the first to hear. Our lecturer next year for 2010 will be Dr. Marva Dawn, who will address the topic of worship. Dr. Dawn is a theologian, author, educator, and I think of special interest to us here in Canada, a teaching fellow in spiritual theology at Regent College in Vancouver. She is a prolific writer on a variety of topics, both in biblical studies, ethics, children's ministry, which I really appreciate. But two of her books on worship are Reaching Out Without Dumbing Down, A Theology of Worship for These Urgent Times, and that was listed by the Academy of Parish Clergy as one of the top 10 books of 1996. Then, subsequent to that, was A Royal Waste of Time, The Splendor of Worshiping God and Being Church for the World, and again listed by the Academy of Parish Clergy as one of the top 10 books for 2000. So you'll want to put that in your calendar. I was most privileged to host her at First Baptist Church in Edmonton when she came to deliver a lecture series at Taylor Seminary in Edmonton. It is now Taylor Seminary. She's an extraordinary person. She's overcome physical health issues that would overwhelm many of us. She is gracious, an excellent communicator, challenging, and has certainly written most insightfully on worship. Along with the lectures, we will be offering a course on worship that week, as well as other one-week intensives. So start thinking about a continuing education break for yourself, February the 8th to the 12th, 2010. And kind of following along on that, I would urge you to please fill out your evaluation forms so that you may help us prepare adequately, both for the types of workshops you might like, as well as your interest for courses. Now, it's my distinct privilege to introduce our 2009 Simpson guest lecturer for his final address. You've already heard two very fulsome introductions this week, so I will be brief tonight. I want to say how much I've connected personally with Dr. Sider with his lectures. Having been spiritually nurtured by Mennonite parents within the Baptist Church family here in Atlantic Canada, Dr. Sider's balanced approach to being Christian has resonated strongly with me and reflects the formative influences in my own life. I grew up in a home where Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship, which is based on the Sermon on the Mount, stood next to the Bible on the bookshelf, figuratively speaking. I especially appreciate Dr. Sider's emphasis on relating to the whole person, which is what I attempt to teach and demonstrate in my own courses at ADC. And I also appreciate his personal honesty and transparency as he has shared his own struggles in his own life. I trust you'll agree with me that he has touched our minds and our hearts, our consciences and our souls, as he has led us to wrestle deeply with what it means to live authentically as Christ followers. Now, before I turn the podium over to him, and Dr. Gardner, I forgot my little parcel on the floor there. Thank you. I have a little gift to share with him, specifically to take home to his wife, Arbutus. If Dr. Sider would like to come up. It's an exquisite picture of the trailing arbutus, our provincial flower, more commonly known as the Mayflower. And I hope it serves to remind him of us and to encourage them both to visit us again, perhaps at a more congenial time of year. Yes. Blessings to you.
That's very special to me, and my wife will love it as well. Really appreciate it.
Can we see it?
I don't know if you can.
No?
Well, thank you indeed. That really is very special to me, and I know Arbutus will be absolutely delighted. I want to talk tonight about thinking biblically about politics, and my first comment needs to be that just because you're a good Christian doesn't mean you get your politics right. Now, I thought of illustrating that with more recent figures like Stephen Harper and George W. Bush, but then I decided I would stay away from that. And instead, let me go back a little bit and perhaps be less controversial. One example is Jesse Helms. He was a long-time Republican senator in the U.S. He was one of the very articulate, strong voices for pro-life, very, very opposed to abortion. And he was highly influential and important politician in that regard. But he happened to come from North Carolina, which is the largest tobacco growing state in the United States. And so, of course, he supported government subsidies for tobacco, and he even supported using government funds to ship U.S. tobacco abroad under our Food for Peace program. Not, I would suggest, a completely pro-life agenda. Interestingly, I need to add this for you Baptists. A decade or so ago, the Southern Baptist Convention at its annual convention made a statement, a negative statement about smoking and tobacco. And a number of the state conventions did the same thing, but somehow in its wisdom, the North Carolina Baptist Convention didn't feel called by God to do that. The other story comes from Nicaragua. Miguel de Escoto was a Catholic priest. I knew him. Like Jesse Helms, I think genuinely a Christian. He was the foreign minister in the 1980s under the Sandinistas. And you'll remember the Sandinistas were a mixture of things, nationalists, some pretty heavily Marxist-Leninist members of the party. Miguel de Escoto went to Moscow about 1987 and accepted the Lenin Peace Prize and went around the Soviet Union making speeches saying that the Soviet Union was the last best hope for Earth. Not, I would suggest, entirely perceptive as late as 1987. Just because you're a good Christian doesn't mean you get your politics right. So how do we get our politics right? Well, that's what we want to try to think together tonight about. What's clear is that evangelicals today are up to our ears in politics. After decades of withdrawal, we're now vigorously engaged in political activity all around the world. The opportunities, I think, are enormous, but the lack of thoughtful preparation, it seems to me, is showing pretty badly. You can see that involvement, of course, in the U.S., Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority in the 80s, or Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition in the 90s, or the massive evangelical support for George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004, 78% I think it was in 2004, or Jim Wallace' very close connection with President Obama. In the last decades, evangelicals in other parts of the world have also been increasingly engaged. In Latin America and Asia, we have had, I believe, in Africa, we have had 8 evangelical presidents just in the last 20 or so years. And there have been in just Brazil alone a number of Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking evangelical political parties. Well, there's a recent book by an evangelical political scientist, Paul Freston, published by Cambridge University Press, and he surveys and analyzes this sweeping new evangelical political engagement in the developing world. And his conclusion, Well, in spite of positive developments, Preston says, there's widespread confusion, ineptitude, misguided policies, and considerable ineptitude and even corruption. In Zambia, for example, President Frederick Chiluba was widely known as an evangelical. He was elected president of Zambia in 1991. He appointed several evangelical pastors to his cabinet. He proclaimed that Zambia was a Christian nation, and he said, I quote, I submit the government of Zambia to the lordship of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, Chiluba violated human rights, tortured opponents in custody, bought votes, and allowed widespread corruption in the government. And when he tried to change the Constitution so he could run for a third term, he tear-gassed opponents. Preston blames much of this kind of failure on a lack of systematic evangelical reflection on the nature of political engagement. He says, and I quote, a community that goes from apoliticism to political involvement without teaching on biblical political ethics will be susceptible to the prevailing political culture. Ed Dobson, who was Jerry Falwell's vice president in Moral Majority in the early years, later on lamented the lack of systematic, coherent reflection. And he said their approach in those years was ready, fire, aim. The absence of any widely accepted systematic evangelical reflection on politics leads, I think, to contradiction, confusion, ineffectiveness, even biblical unfaithfulness. Consider one example: the inconsistency with regard to the sanctity of human life. Almost all evangelicals agree with the basic principle that every human being is inestimably precious. But many highly visible evangelical pro-life movements focus largely on the question of abortion, as if, as one wag commented, life begins at conception and ends at birth. But what about the millions of children who die every year of starvation, or the millions of adults killed annually by tobacco smoke? Are those not also pro-life issues? Evangelical failure to develop a systematic, comprehensive political philosophy contrasts sharply with what other Christian traditions, especially Catholics, have done. As you know, Roman Catholics have well over 100 years of careful, systematic reflection, especially in the papal encyclicals. Mainline Protestants have people like Reinhold Niebuhr and many others who have thought carefully about it. We simply don't have that level of careful political reflection in the evangelical community, although thank God that it is changing significantly in the last few years. Now, some people, after getting into politics for a little while, or after observing it a little bit, conclude this is such a mess, we simply ought to stay away from it, avoid it. And I want to say, absolutely not, no, for two reasons. The one is practical, and the other is theological. The first point is that it's a simple historical fact that political decisions have a huge impact, for good or ill, on the lives of literally billions of people. Think of the devastation and death that the world might have avoided if German Christian voters had not elected Hitler to office. Think of the freedom and goodness and joy that followed for tens of millions of people from the fact that evangelical political activist and MP William Wilberforce labored for over 30 years and eventually persuaded his colleagues in the British Parliament to outlaw first the slave trade and then slavery throughout the British Empire. It's through politics that country after country has come to enjoy democracy. It is through politics that nation after nation has stopped jailing and killing heretics. It is through politics that Marxist-Leninist totalitarianism first conquered and devastated and then waned and disappeared in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It is through politics that we develop laws that either restrain or permit abortion, that allow or forbid gay marriage, that harm or empower the poor, that protect or destroy the environment. Politics is simply too important to ignore. And the theological reason for political engagement, I think, is even more compelling. The central Christian confession is that Jesus is now Lord, Lord of the entire universe. The New Testament explicitly says that he is now the ruler of the kings of the earth. All authority, he said, in heaven and on earth has been given to the risen Lord. Christians who know that must submit every corner of their lives to this wonderful Lord. And if we live in democratic societies where we have the freedom to vote, our votes, or even our failure to vote, shapes what happens in the important area of political life. One way we Christians love our neighbor and live out our belief that Christ is Lord, even of political life, is to think and pray for the wisdom to act politically in ways that best reflect the fact that Christ is Lord. But that, of course, raises a very important question. Is there an approach? Is there a method? Is there a framework which will help us to do that? And this is what I want to flesh out for you in this lecture. I want to, in fact, do four things, briefly. First of all, I want to provide an overview of my methodology for moving from biblical faith to concrete political decisions. Second, I want to sketch what I call a normative biblical framework for that engagement. Third, I want to outline what I take to be a biblically shaped, factually informed political philosophy. And then finally, I'll make a few comments about the way the evangelical world is changing politically, especially in the U.S., and what that might mean for evangelical Catholic cooperation in particular. First of all, then, my methodology. A faithful Christian political methodology requires that we understand that every political judgment has four different components, at least. There is, first of all, some normative framework. Second, there is some kind of broad study of society and the world. Now, the people involved may not be systematically thinking about either of those things, but in fact, both of those factors are present. And then, out of those two, there is a political philosophy, third. And finally, there is some detailed social analysis to apply that political philosophy. Let's look a little more carefully at each of those points. And first of all, the normative framework. Every person's political judgments about any substantive political issue is grounded finally in that person's deepest philosophical and or religious beliefs. People who claim to have some kind of neutral, objective starting point for their politics are either trying to kid themselves or you. Even John Rawls, who used to claim that he had that kind of neutral, objective starting point, now admits that, in fact, he starts with his own particular philosophical perspective. Now, if one's political activity is to be genuinely Christian, then, of course, the guiding norms for one's politics must come from the center of one's faith. Since biblical faith teaches that some sense of the true and the good is embedded in the human conscience, common wisdom, call it natural law if you like, some common wisdom can give guidance for our politics. Some Christians, especially Roman Catholics, believe that it's still possible to derive major input for one's political normative framework from general revelation. My own inclination is to think that since the fall has deeply clouded our understanding of God's law written on our hearts, therefore general revelation by itself cannot be the primary source of the Christian's normative framework for political thought. And so for clarity, I turn to the Scriptures, to the revealed truth in the Bible. But of course, discovering relevant biblical norms for specific political issues is not an easy matter. It's not a simple matter of proof texting. The Bible is full of commands and stories and proverbs, in short, a wide variety of materials written over many centuries. To develop a fully biblical perspective on political issues, we need two things, I think. First of all, we need a biblical view of the world and persons coming from what I call the biblical story, just the whole story from creation, fall, redemption, and Christ's return. And second, we need an understanding of biblical teaching related to specific concrete issues, like the family, economic justice, and so on. I call these biblical paradigms. To develop a normative biblical framework for our political thinking, we must in principle examine all relevant biblical passages. We must understand each text according to proper principles of exegesis. And then we need to formulate a comprehensive summary of all of those relevant canonical texts. The most sweeping comprehensive summary would be, of course, the summary of the biblical story and what that tells us about the nature of persons, for example. And then the other comprehensive summaries or biblical paradigms would cover things like the poor, the family, work, justice, and so on. So first of all, I'm saying we need a normative framework, and for me that comes from the scriptures in the way I've tried to describe briefly. Second, we need a broad study of history and the world. By itself, the normative biblical framework is not enough. Nothing in the Bible I've ever discovered has an explicit discussion of the pros and cons of a global market economy or the impact of 7 billion people on the natural environment, and one could go on. In addition, then, to a normative biblical framework, we need a broad, comprehensive study of our world. And that takes many forms. It includes reflection on the historical development of society and the economy and political systems. You know, we're finite historical beings, and so we learn, at least we ought to learn, in the course of human history. One's analysis of the history of economics and politics and so on helps to shape one's political philosophy. Example, as the Marxist experiment worked itself out in the course of the 20th century, I think it became more and more clear not only that Marxist philosophy contradicted the biblical view of persons, but also that in practice, Marxism led to economic inefficiency and political totalitarianism. I think similarly, it's becoming increasingly clear that substantial injustice accompanies the functioning of today's market economies. So we need, I'm arguing, a broad study of history. And third, we need what I call a political philosophy. In addition to the normative biblical framework, and second, a broad study of society, Christians engaged in politics simply have to have a political philosophy. It's simply impossible. Every time you want to make a political decision to spend days, actually years and years, reviewing the mountains of relevant biblical material for your political decision. And then at the same time, spending years reviewing the relevant study of society. You need a framework. You need a roadmap. You need a handy guide. That's what a political philosophy is. Now, we dare not adopt our political philosophy uncritically from some non-Christian source. It must emerge, if we're serious Christians, from our normative biblical framework on the one hand, and on the other from our careful, painstaking economic, social analysis of history in the world. So we need a handy roadmap, a political philosophy. And everybody has one implicitly at least, even if they haven't thought about it systematically. It's better to think about it systematically. Finally, the fourth factor in any political decision is some more detailed socioeconomic analysis. If you're going to decide whether or not to vote for Mr. McCain or Mr. Obama or whatever, you've got to study their platforms and apply your political philosophy to that particular legislative item or this particular election. So those are the four pieces of any political judgment, and that gives you a quick comment about how I try to approach this issue of thinking politically. One other preliminary comment, and that is this. I think it's absolutely crucial that we Christians start within the Christian community to think about politics. If we don't start there, we're going to end up adopting secular norms and secular values from some other secular political ideology. And the result will be a compromise, often fundamentally unchristian, political engagement. Now, I think that's exactly what's happened to Christians in politics in my own country in the last several decades. Too many Christians adopted either left-wing or right-wing politics. The result has been a sub-Christian religious right that I think largely correctly championed the family and the sanctity of human life, but neglected economic justice for the poor, uncritically endorsed American nationalism, ignored environmental concerns for God's creation, and neglected the struggle against racism. Equally sub-Christian, I would argue, has been a religious left that rightly defended justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, but then largely forgot about the importance of the family and sexual integrity, sometimes even uncritically endorsed Marxism, certainly endorsed the sexual revolution, overlooked the fact that freedom is just as important as justice, and failed to defend the most vulnerable of all, the unborn and the very old. We must start with conversation within the body of Christ if we're not going to be seduced by secular ideologies of left and right. Briefly, I've tried to sketch my methodology. Now let me develop it, secondly, by showing you in a little more detail how I develop what I call the normative biblical framework. Remember I said that the biblical story is my starting point. I think the basic biblical story provides an absolutely crucial set of ideas for a Christian political philosophy. The entire created order, we're told, is good and precious because it comes from the hand of a loving God. Persons created in the image of God are called to a servant-like stewardship over the rest of the Creator's handiwork. Tragically, of course, humanity has rebelled against God, and the result is selfish persons, twisted social relationships and institutions, and even a groaning, disordered creation. Unwilling, however, to forsake fallen humanity, the Creator began a long historic process of salvation to restore a right relationship among God and persons and the creation around them. And at the center of that redeeming grace is Jesus Christ, Nazarene carpenter and eternal Word, who models perfect humanity, atones for our sins, rises from the dead to break the power of evil. History is moving toward the second coming, toward the risen Lord's return, when all things will be restored to wholeness. This biblical story provides a foundation for thinking about a whole bunch of things crucial to politics. The nature and the dignity and destiny of persons, the status of the non-human world, the importance of the historical process, and so on. So I want to start with the biblical story. And then secondly, I want to develop biblical paradigms on a whole cluster of issues. And I will develop a few just to illustrate how I try to do that. The first one is the special dignity and sanctity of every human being. Every person, and I think only human beings, are made in the image of God, called to stewardship of the non-human creation, made to find fulfillment only when rightly related to God, neighbor, the earth, and the self, and summoned to respond in freedom to God's invitation of salvation, invited, in fact, to live forever in the presence of God. Now, I think, and I didn't always think this, but I've come to the conclusion that we must act on the belief that from the moment of conception, we are dealing with human life. There is no extended biblical passage that explicitly teaches that. There certainly is none that denies it. There are a number of texts that use words for the unborn that are normally applied to those who have been born. For 19 centuries, the Christian church has been overwhelmingly opposed to abortion. Modern science now demonstrates with astounding detail that from the moment of conception, a genetically distinct human being with a continuous biological development exists. If one is uncertain whether this developing fetus is a human being, then I think one should adopt that view as a working assumption. Why? Because to do otherwise would be like shooting blindly into a darkened theater with the justification that we cannot know whether we will hit empty chairs or human beings. The directly intended taking of innocent human life, I think, whether in abortion or euthanasia, is wrong. Or a second paradigm, more briefly, freedom of belief. Throughout biblical history, God gives persons enormous freedom to respond in obedience or rebellion, unbelief or faith in God. Now, I know the Old Testament has some things that don't fit with our understanding of religious freedom, but the Old Testament also tells us that God again and again allowed the people of Israel just enormous space to disobey his commands. And Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares shows that God chooses to allow this freedom to persons until the final judgment. And so religious freedom, I think, is an essential element of a good society. Or take the family as another biblical paradigm. Strong, stable families, persons related by blood or marriage or adoption, are absolutely important in the biblical teaching, keeping marriage vows, accepting God's design that sexual intercourse be reserved for a man and a woman united in lifelong marriage covenant, and valuing singles in the extended family are all important aspects of strengthening the family. Or take the issue of justice. The two key Hebrew words, mishpat and zedekah, are used both to talk about fair courts and about just economic relationships. We all agree that the fair courts is crucial. The Bible says don't be biased against the poor or in favor of the poor or against the rich or in favor of the rich. But it also talks a lot about fair economic relationships. I talked about that last night a little bit, that God wants God wants access for everyone to the productive resources so they can earn their own way. Certainly the Bible makes it clear that wrong personal choices result in economic loss, but God didn't want that to continue forever, so every 50 years God says every family gets their own land back. Economic justice is part of what the Bible tells us about the nature of justice. Or the special concern for the poor. Again, I talked about that last night. I won't talk about that. Peacemaking is another example. Christians look forward to the time when nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, unfortunately, until the Lord returns, persons persistently resort to wars and rumors of wars. And many Christians believe that they should, as the lesser of two evils, engage in just wars for the sake of preserving some order and peace. Other Christians believe that killing is always contrary to the teaching of Christ, and that he calls us to overcome our enemies with suffering love rather than the sword. But all Christians agree that Jesus' words, "Blessed are the peacemakers," are urgent, especially for our time. Those are a few of the examples of what I call the biblical paradigms that, together with the biblical story, make up my normative framework for thinking about politics. Obviously, this is just a sketch. There'd be a lot more that should be said. You could write a book on each of those biblical paradigms, for example. But let me move on to the next point, and that is to show you how I move from that normative biblical framework to a political philosophy. The Bible, of course, does not prescribe any particular political philosophy. Political philosophies, I think, emerge as people in community over a period of time integrate a normative framework and careful study and reflection on historical experience. As long as we understand our political philosophy as a useful guide to be regularly improved by more normative thinking, more social analysis, as long as we're clear it's not some kind of unchanging dogma, then it can be a helpful tool for navigating complex political decisions. Here are some of the pieces of my political philosophy, which I hope emerge out of careful reflection on normative biblical principles on the one hand, and on the other, careful socioeconomic study of the world. And if you can show me that at either of those points I've got it wrong, then I'll be glad, eager to change my political philosophy. First part of my political philosophy is what I call democratization and decentralization of power. Now, I think there is both a positive reason and a negative reason for decentralizing all forms of power. The positive reason is this: every person is called to exercise her creation mandate and to become a co-worker with God in shaping history. Now, if a small, tiny elite makes all the decisions, then the majority of us cannot exercise our God-given mandate. That's the positive reason for decentralizing power. But there's a negative one. You remember Lord Acton and his famous statement that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Sinful people in a fallen world will almost always use unchecked centralized power to benefit themselves unfairly and to oppress others. And so to avoid totalitarianism and injustice in a fallen world, power must be decentralized. Second, democracy. And this is really in some ways a subpoint of this decentralization of power. I think a concern for human rights, a concern for individual freedom, and certainly a concern to decentralize power all point toward a democratic political order. When you've got freedom of speech, secret voting, universal suffrage, political power is profoundly decentralized, at least in theory. And everyone is able to participate in the decisions that shape their lives. And of course, when you separate legislative and administrative and judicial functions, as we do in our democracies, and when you balance national and provincial and local governments, you further decentralize power. Or take a third area, non-governmental institutions. And this, again, in part, is an illustration of decentralizing power. In our societies, we've got a large number of institutions that are intermediate, in between the government and the individual. And these further decentralize power and provide smaller contexts of human communities to flourish. These smaller institutions include the family, the church, the media, the schools, the economy, and a host of even smaller voluntary associations. These intermediate centers of power provide a check on governmental power, and they are an absolutely crucial foundation of freedom for our society. Or take the fourth area, another aspect of my political philosophy, private ownership and a market economy. Now you can see that I'm sketching very broadly. Any one of these could take a whole book. But briefly on this topic, I think the history of the 20th century has shown clearly that when the state owns and controls most of the economy, economic and political power is so centralized that totalitarianism is almost guaranteed. Genuinely decentralizing private ownership, on the other hand, nurtures free individuals and serves as a counterbalance to political power. Determining prices and production via supply and demand has simply proven to be more efficient than central planning. There was actually an agency in Moscow that tried to set 25 million prices every year and set the production levels. Nobody knows enough to do that wisely. Supply and demand simply works more efficiently. But of course, one needs to add that huge privately owned corporations can also become centers of enormous economic power and also political power. When a small group of very wealthy people, like Mr. Murdoch and others, own the corporations that own the media and provide most of the funding for election campaigns, then economic and political power is again dangerously centralized. I think a concern for justice and freedom demands an ongoing vigilance against all forms of centralized economic power. And it demands a constant effort to strengthen smaller centers of economic life, like family-owned farms and businesses, cooperatives, widespread home ownership, and so on. Or take my political philosophy with regard to the family. Government, I think, rightly recognizes and favors the family, that is, those related by blood, marriage, and adoption, and especially the nuclear family, wife, husband, and children, with its larger circle of extended family and grandparents and so on. It rightly recognizes that as an essential element of a stable, wholesome society. The family, not the government, has the primary responsibility for raising children. Religious institutions can do far more than government to strengthen the family, but government should do what it can. That, I think, includes discouraging, although certainly not criminalizing, divorce and sexual promiscuity. I think it includes recognizing that children are best served when they live with both of their biological parents. It also includes not broadening the definition of marriage to include gay partners and not defining family as any two or more people who cohabit. But at the same time, it involves enforcing the basic civil rights of everybody, no matter what their behavior. Government rightly offers tax and other benefits that favor marriage rather than cohabitation or divorce. Another area, caring for creation and a sustainable planet. I think responsible care for creation flows from a biblical worldview, We obviously face a long-term environmental crisis. Utilitarian attitudes must be balanced by a recognition of the intrinsic worth of all God's creation and human responsibility to act as God's faithful stewards. Human beings have far more worth than plants or animals. So if I have to choose between the life of a human being and protecting endangered species, I will choose the human life. But very seldom, if ever, do we have to choose between taking a human life and destroying an endangered species. Usually it's a choice between growing affluence and obliterating the handiwork of the Creator. I could go on and talk about a variety of other things, the role of government, the priority of the poor. I'm going to skip some of those things, just one or two final pieces of my political philosophy. And I want to mention what I call a consistent ethic of life. I think one of the very first, probably the first and most basic human right is the inviolable right to life of every human being. I think the first and most basic responsibility of civil law is to ensure that this right is recognized and protected. And I think, as I suggested earlier, that abortion involves the direct, intentional, and violent taking of human life. I think no law which legitimizes the direct killing of innocent human beings through abortion is just. And so I think we should work for the legal protection of the unborn and oppose public funding of abortions. At the same time, we must develop a wide range of alternatives to abortion, both to reduce the evil of abortion and also in recognition that there are two people directly involved, not just the baby. A caring society will surround women with unwanted pregnancies with love and concrete support, including financial assistance and better adoption alternatives. I also think that euthanasia, the direct killing of the aged and infirm, either with or without their consent, is wrong. That does not mean that it's immoral to refuse or withhold extraordinary medical treatment when death is imminent or inevitable. But we dare not blur the distinction between, on the one hand, allowing a person to die, and on the other hand, killing a person. But concern for a consistent ethic of life does not end with abortion and euthanasia. Life, as I said, does not begin at conception and end at birth. Tens of millions of people die unnecessarily every year of starvation and malnutrition and AIDS. Tobacco kills millions of people prematurely every year. Capital punishment kills human beings. Should we really kill people to teach people that killing is wrong? We should seek to protect the sanctity of human life wherever it is threatened and violated. I think that respect for human life is what Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago used to call a seamless garment. A consistent ethic of life opposes and seeks to reduce not only abortion and euthanasia, but also capital punishment, starvation, cigarette-induced cancer, and on the list goes. Well, that in brief, very briefly as you see, is the kind of political philosophy that I hope flows from my methodology. I hope it flows consistently from my normative biblical vision on the one hand, and on the other, a careful study of the world. Now, to arrive at any specific conclusion, how to vote last fall in our election, for example, one, of course, has to apply that political philosophy to a concrete political situation. I tried to do that this fall. Finally, just a few comments about what I think is quite dramatic change in the U.S. with regard to evangelical political engagement. For more than a decade, there has been a growing movement that goes beyond the two issues of abortion and family. There was, for 10 years or more, a growing concern with human rights, religious freedom, Southern Sudan, sexual trafficking, and so on, to the point where one of the important writers of the New York Times in an op-ed said there's a new evangelical internationalism that's emerging. There, of course, has been the amazing growth of evangelical relief and development agencies, $2-3 billion a year programs now around the world. In 2004, the National Association of Evangelicals, the largest evangelical agency in the U.S., represents about 30 million people, unanimously adopted a document for the health of the nation. And that document explicitly rejected one or two issue politics. It said that if we're going to be faithful evangelicals in our civic engagement, then we must ask, what's God concerned about? And the document says that God seems to be concerned about the sanctity of human life and the poor, the family, and racial justice, and creation care, and peacemaking. And that document has got enormous amount of attention and is now the framework for the National Association of Evangelicals in its political engagement. In 2006, a wide range of centrist evangelicals endorsed the Evangelical Climate Initiative, saying that global warming is happening, the science is clear, we must act now, we want national legislation. Again, that got major attention. Rick Warren is clearly positioning himself. He's probably the most influential evangelical in the U.S. today, and he's clearly positioning himself to be not the religious right. He's conservative on abortion and on marriage issues, but he's also concerned with environmental issues and with AIDS and with economic justice abroad. I think it's accurate to say that the religious right in the U.S. no longer, if it ever did, no longer speaks for the evangelical center. There's a strong new evangelical center emerging that is concerned with the sanctity of human life and economic justice, the family and racial justice, creation care, and peacemaking. And that's major, I think, in terms of new development. One final comment, and that is that the growing potential for evangelical Catholic cooperation. For several years now, the third meeting will happen just in a month at Eastern University. For several years now, there's been an evangelical Catholic dialogue. As we looked at that new National Association of Evangelicals document for the health of the nation and compared it with Catholic social teaching, we saw that there's an enormous overlap. In fact, you have to look very hard to find differences. In the U.S., Catholics and evangelicals make up half of the voters. And so we have asked, is there a way to figure out how to have those two communities work far more closely together in systematic, organized ways over the next couple decades to try to nudge the society toward a deeper understanding of all of those issues? If we do, I think we'll have a pro-life and pro-poor, pro-family and pro-racial justice, pro-creation care and pro-peacemaking agenda. And if we do that successfully, we will, in fact, significantly shape American politics. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say by way of getting the discussion going.
Once. Okay, thank you, Danny. There is going to be some engagement. I think that lecture was packed with issues that will invite you to respond. So we do have some time for questions. And are there any to start off with? Sure.
I might just add, while the first person is coming, that I obviously think that my specific political conclusions are far less authoritative than what I said, let's say, in the first lecture about the importance of evangelism and social action. But I do think we need to get to concrete political conclusions. Please, go ahead.
You've outlined in your talk an exhausting process to get to a political position. And the reality is that life is short. And that leaves us open to getting our information from where we can, and that leaves us open to manipulation. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on how we avoid being manipulated.
Yeah, that's a real good question, and it's a real problem. I think it means that we ought to have processes within the body of Christ to be working at these things. I certainly don't want pastors and church leaders making 5 political pronouncements every month. But I think we ought to be nurturing people who understand how to think about politics. I think we also need organizations, perhaps parachurch organizations, that in fact work at this more systematically and more extensively. I also don't mean to suggest that you shouldn't be engaged politically until you've spent 5 years doing what I've just outlined. I think you can begin to apply that framework. You have some sense of key normative biblical principles, and you have some reading of history, just as a educated Canadian. If you begin to think systematically about it, you'll begin to see how, well, maybe this particular biblical principle will lead to modification of this or that. I fundamentally changed my position on abortion in my lifetime. I used to be so pro-abortion that I thought it was perfectly fine to use it as a population control measure. And I've, as you can see, fundamentally changed that. We ought to be growing in the course of getting older and reading more. So, start where you are. Keep thinking about it as you can. Be a part of a body of Christians where you've got some people that think about it even more. The Christian ethicist at Acadia Divinity College has got more time to think about that than many of you do. Those kinds of persons, have a special responsibility to help us in that. So I wouldn't want what I've said to lead you to say, "Oh my gosh, that's so complex that it's impossible." I would rather have you conclude that, okay, that's a basic framework. I've got some biblical principles. I've done some thinking about the world, even though it's modest, and I see how that fits together. So I'll keep building on that. Does that work?
Can I come back? Okay. The thing that bothers me is that we have a lack of that process going on. And as I said in my first comment, that leaves us open to manipulation. The thing that particularly worries me is the way in which single issue politics is pushed at the Christian body. And I'm thinking particularly of abortion. Abortion is a big issue, but it is not the issue. But the manipulation makes it appear that it is the issue. It is the only issue that matters. And I wonder sort of how we deal with that kind of very cynical manipulation at the top level.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly manipulation of that issue, and there are also devout Catholics and evangelicals who really do believe that that is the overriding issue. I respect that, although I think it's wrong. The way I want to say it is that I think, the religious right in my own country that focused on that issue and marriage, sexuality issues, the problem was it wasn't biblical enough. I mean, if you're going to be a Christian in politics, surely you've got to ask the question, what does God care about? And you go back to the Bible and ask that question, and if probably the second most common theme in the Bible is God's concern for the poor, surely economic justice has got to be one of the important issues. And surely, peacemaking is there. And I think we've missed it, but there's an awful lot about care for God's creation. So I want to say pretty pointedly to the one issue or two issue people, you're just not biblical enough when you go that way. If God cares about all these issues, we must as well. Now that means that you've got tough decisions to make because in my own voting in the U.S. For a long time, I liked the Republican candidate better on some issues and the Democrat better on other issues. And so it gets very difficult.
No, I'll wait. It's okay.
Thomas Oden has been encouraging that evangelicals don't go down a road that he traveled.
I'm sorry, who was the first name?
Thomas Oden. Thomas Oden?
Oden. Oh, yes.
Oden.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And cautioning about that. And what I'm wondering about is what makes you hopeful that in this generation and potential that we're not going to travel down familiar dead-end roads?
Well, I think that's an absolutely crucial question. Several things. First of all, we must be real clear that politics is not the most important issue way to change the world. It's one significant thing we should do, but it's not as important as evangelism. Finally, long term, it doesn't change the world as importantly as the evangelizing of persons when their whole lives are changed. So let's not overstate the importance of politics. Let's be real clear that no politician, no matter how much we like that person, is going to bring in the millennium. Every politician will be a mixture of good and bad and will disappoint. So we have to have realistic expectations of what we can achieve in the political process. And we mustn't overstate it, but we mustn't understate it either. I ticked off a variety of things that happened because of political engagement. I think they're important. It was a good thing that we ended slavery in the U.S. It would be better if we could have done it without a civil war. If politics had succeeded in doing that without civil war, that would have been a huge achievement. So that, I think, is an absolutely crucial perspective to see that the limited but substantial importance of political engagement. Second thing is we've got to be very, very careful to not identify Christian faith with one particular party. A lot of evangelicals in the U.S. did that in the last couple decades. A number of us are trying hard to make sure we don't do it now in a different way with President Obama. And in fact, there's a significant group of Christians that are meeting off the record to try to help each other, to think carefully about that. Some of us have some pretty good connections with the Obama White House, and the last thing I want to do is repeat, the cycle of uncritically endorsing President Obama. He's wrong at a number of points. He'll make big mistakes, and it's absolutely crucial that we be ready to critique when we think there is mistake there. So that kind of careful distancing is essential. I think the other thing is, it wasn't, I think, primarily that mainline Protestants had political engagement that got them into trouble. It was that they'd forgotten about evangelism and didn't care about it, and they had a weak theology, a liberal theology, and so they didn't have the kind of protections that I think a solid biblical theology and a passion for evangelism would bring. I think if we get those things straight, we can avoid the political seduction. But it's powerful. I mean, you walk into the White House and meet the president, and it undermines your courage to speak truth to power. So it's complex and tricky. There's danger there, but I don't think it means that we should just be apolitical. But Tom Oden's is a friend, and I respect him enormously, and I want to hear those kinds of warnings loudly and clearly.
I have two questions. I'll ask the first one. It's a very urgent issue here in Canada. We've lost our most privileged nation status because of our disregard for Aboriginal rights in this country. Whether it's sociologically, economically, ethically, missiologically, Canadians in general and our evangelical churches have lost a public voice on this issue. Maybe we've simply let the United Church, the Anglican Church, and the Catholic Church take the blows for sad past. Why is it that we as a nation, and I think, the United States would be able to associate itself with this comment, why is it that we as a nation would have such an indifference to the plight of the poorest of the poor who are among us? And I am thinking specifically of Aboriginals in Canada, or First Nations.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly the case that both in Canada and the U.S., we've done awful things to the Native peoples. We stole their land. In the U.S., we made hundreds of treaties that we just consistently broke. Here and there, you've got examples of committed Christians that stood against that. One of the things I like about Charles Finney, and he was the sort of the Billy Graham in the middle of the 19th century, but he was also one of the champions against slavery, and he was one of the founders of Oberlin College. It's now a very good secular school, but it was a thoroughly evangelical school in the 1840s and 50s and so on. And they would send out missionaries. They were very passionate about evangelism. They would send out missionaries to the Indians, but they also stood with the Indians and shouted and screamed about the way the American government was breaking the treaties with the Indians. Now, if we had been consistently there, the whole history of European, Native Canadian, Native American relations would be fundamentally different. I think it's just a sinful failure. Our self-interest overcame any kind of biblical understanding of justice, and we have to repent.
Go to the mic for 1 second. Very simple question. We've been inspired by listening to you over the last 3 days. Can we ask you to open a little window on your own person and tell us where your inspiration is coming from? Who are you reading? I think particularly in the developing world, who are the type of people that you're trying to pay attention to in the formation of significant radical Christian thought? Who are some of the voices that we as a Canadian audience could benefit from paying attention to? Some of the people that you're being inspired by?
I sometimes try to reflect on that question. In terms of the books that have been influential, it's C.S. Lewis, Miracles in particular. It's George Ladd's New Testament theology and the Gospel of the Kingdom that I got there. It's Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline for the Inward Journey. It's John Howard Yoder's Politics of Jesus, Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship. Those are among the books that have especially been important for shaping me. I think another crucial part of my life was I grew up a relatively poor Canadian farm boy. I didn't grow up among the rich. I was blessed to get a very good education, and that changed my life in important ways. But I've always felt a kind of emotional identification with the people at the bottom. I've lived with African Americans for a lot of my life, and a lot of my concern has been shaped by African Americans in the U.S. I have had the privilege of working with developing country evangelicals, Samuel Escobar and Rene Padilla, for example, people my age, Vinay Samuel from India, and the whole network of third world evangelical theologians committed to holistic ministry. That's been an important part of the shaping of my life. One of my colleagues, Al Tizon, T-I-Z-O-N, has just written a superb book on the history of that whole movement of third world evangelical theologians slash activists working at holistic ministry that is well worth reading. That would be a quick set of comments on that.
Thank you. I come here with much trepidation because what I'm going to tell you about is a very bad experience I had, and it's. I just want you to know my heart. Everything you've been talking about is near and dear to my heart, but God has just placed this burden on my heart, and I can't get away from it. One thing I want to say in preface is that Jesus wrote the Golden Rule.
Jesus
wrote the Golden Rule, not the ruler company or 3M or anyone like that, but in my view, he was the one that gave us. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto yourself. But I took the time and prayed and prepared to go to the all-candidates debate in Fredericton before the election. And there were 5 candidates, Conservative, Liberal, Green, NDP, and the Young People's Party. anyway, I can't remember the name of it, but it was moderated by the local editor of the local newspaper. And I asked if I could ask a two-part question, and I might point out that several two-part questions had been asked. And here's the question that I proposed. Number one, if you knew that there was a law on the books in Canada that meant that human beings would be harmed grievously, would you take action to see that that was taken off the books? Would you try to have it changed? The moderator interrupted right away, said, "You're trying to set someone up here." I wasn't. Well, he said, "You better ask the B part of your question." The B part of my question was, do you people know what actually takes place in an abortion procedure? Well, then the boo started and all that, but that I was prepared for that. And the Green Party answered first, and of course she said, "I'm for a woman's right to choose." No discussion. And then right down through the rest, except the young man, a Christian, a born-again Christian, who was running for, of all parties, the NDP, was honest enough to explain his point of view. The others followed what the Green Party lady said. And these are educated, intelligent, well-thought-of men and women that ran, and eventually the Conservative was elected. And that, on one level, bothered me. I wasn't trying to trick anyone. I believe in education. And I watched The Silent Scream again, and I heard how the man who performed that procedure was taken into the editing room after the procedure, and he had done thousands of procedures, and he'd never seen what he was doing. When you said shooting in a theater dark, you know? So I'll get to the point. I understood all the catcalls from the people, but really what bothered me was the Christians that I knew were in the audience that I consulted afterwards, and to a person who's, "What are you doing asking a question like that?" So I've been listening to you all week about the personal sin and the community, or, sin. A lot of Christians in various levels of authority don't want to talk about it. And I don't understand why. And I don't know how we can expect to have, and I agree, I love the way you chart out how we can learn and be involved, and we should be. We've just had a born-again man elected the head of the Conservative Party in New Brunswick. But how can people take us seriously if on a point like that we're not willing to just stand up in love and gentleness and say, "I believe that it's harmful for a human being, and it ought to change," like you said tonight. I'm just interested on your...
Yeah, well, I would affirm what you did and say that we need to figure out how to raise that kind of question in the most winsome way possible. I don't think we do it successfully by carrying signs, "baby killer," and things of that sort. And too often, both on this issue and on the gay issue, we have done it very, very badly. But we must raise these important issues, and in doing so, we test whether or not the society is really serious about what it says it believes, namely for genuine freedom of speech and genuine tolerance. That ought to mean that the society is open to people thinking very different thoughts and us listening carefully to all those different viewpoints. Now, we know very well that there are both people on the right and people on the left that are pretty intolerant and don't want to listen to other points of view. I was struck with the case just in the last couple of days here, or this weekend maybe it was, at St. Mary's University, I believe, where a pro-life person from Alberta, I believe, was shouted down, and the response to the university was not to evict the people who were shutting him down, but to end the conversation. We can be wise champions of genuine freedom of speech at this point in time on that issue and some other issues. But it takes courage, and sometimes we'll be shouted down and treated badly. After the Proposition 8, which passed in California at the last election, which reversed a California Supreme Court decision and defined marriage as between a man and a woman, there were vicious attacks on the Mormons and other people, other religious people who had supported Proposition 8 to the point where it was just pretty serious, nasty stuff. And some of us signed a full-page ad in the New York Times saying this kind of behavior is just not acceptable in a free society that wants to respect different viewpoints.
Okay, I'm going to allow 2 more questions because I saw 2 people come to the mic, but Dr. Sider has to get to the airport hotel tonight, so we can't hold him too long. So Peter and then Jennifer.
I'm going to try and keep my question short so you can answer. The question really, Dr. Sider, really appreciated what you shared tonight. As you know, quite large differences between Canada and the U.S., not only politically, but in terms of the way that religion works out in public life. And in Canada, it tends to be much more of a private issue. And so our politicians, I think, on whatever side, tend to want to avoid those kinds of things. And maybe Hal has raised that particular issue in terms of how do we, in this country, raise issues in a thoughtful, intelligent way that they will be heard, because it seems like, for the most part, religion in Canada is almost scorned, where in the U.S. Politicians have to listen to people, whether they're on the right or left. Here it's like, it's scorned and almost irrelevant, I think our voice is in Canada. So if you could just answer that, please.
Yeah. That prompts me to make one important clarification. The fact that I said it's crucial to start in the religious community and develop a normative biblical framework as the source of one's principles and norms for one's political engagement does not mean that when you proceed to move into the larger society and argue for this or that political position that you then quote Bible verses or that you're even explicitly religious in that discussion. When you move from what you have sorted out as your own framework and your own conclusions on issues, and I do think we need to do that in the body of Christ so we help each other do that better. But once we move into the world, we need to ask, how can we communicate? What is the best way to help the larger society understand us? And that, of course, depends on the political setting. It's still possible in the U.S. in some cases to use even explicit biblical kinds of arguments. It isn't always, in fact, with some frequency, it's not wise, but sometimes it is. It's less likely to be wise for you. But you can argue in terms of long-term self-interest, in terms of the common good, a variety of arguments that people in general can understand. And so that translation of one's position and one's reasons for positions into language that the whole society can understand is absolutely crucial. And figuring out how to do that in a way that is effective, in a way that's sensitive and winsome, all of that's crucial.
I don't really have a question, but I do have a comment. And on a more hopeful note, some of us went to see the movie Juno about the teenage girl that got pregnant and all the inner struggles she had to decide whether to keep the baby and so on. And there was a scene in the movie that was really optimistic because she was on her way to the abortion clinic, and there were indeed protesters outside of the clinic. And one of the protesters yelled at Juno and saying something, I don't remember the exact phrase, but your baby's heart is already beating or something along that line. And Juno just was frozen in her tracks, and she couldn't get it out of her head. And I thought, well, this is one of the rare occasions when actually a witness, and it, you know, it might not have been the best witness, but it was still a witness, had a very positive and beautiful effect, and it was depicted beautifully in the movie. So it was just a really encouraging movie for me.
Well, thank you. I think the crisis pregnancy centers, which have sprung up over the last several decades in the U.S., hundreds of places, have been important ways to express love for young mothers who are pregnant and are struggling with that pregnancy. Being willing to walk with those young mothers as they carry the baby to term is a crucial part of how we express a pro-life agenda. I think in the U.S. right now there is some possibility for finding some common ground. We're certainly not going to find common ground over whether or not to dramatically reduce the legal availability of abortion. That's not going to change in any kind of short term, to put it mildly. But we may very well be able to find some common ground on measures that would reduce abortion, more support for mothers who choose to carry children, babies to term, and so on. And I think those kinds of efforts to seek common ground is one important thing that we should be about. My final comment would just be that, to say again, I don't think that political engagement is the most important thing we do. I don't want the Baptists of Canada or the Evangelicals of Canada to become preoccupied with politics. I just think it's one of the significant things we do because Christ is Lord of all, and I think it does provide an important way that we love our neighbor, and so we must do it more carefully and systematically. I think we need more global dialogue on this. I think American evangelicals would benefit enormously if they were listening to Canadian evangelicals and evangelicals around the world in terms of their political engagement. I think that kind of dialogue is important. I might just end by saying that the World Evangelical Alliance, that is the global network of national evangelical fellowships and alliances. I think I mentioned that Jeff Tunnicliffe, who's a Canadian in Vancouver, is the very creative and gifted head of that World Evangelical Alliance. I've been asked to lead a process in the World Evangelical Alliance, and the process is to support national evangelical fellowships around the world so that they can have a 30-month process, bring together a broadly representative group of evangelicals in Zambia or Philippines or whatever, and ask the question, what is a biblically faithful, factually grounded approach to political life at this point in time in this country? And the World Evangelical Alliance is going to provide some support for that. I've had the privilege of being asked to lead and guide that. And hopefully, in the course of that, we'll have a lot more evangelicals in different places thinking more carefully and wisely about political engagement. And in the process, I hope there'll be more global dialogue because it's perfectly clear that national boundaries bring blinkers and limitations, and when we dialogue in the global body, we are helped to get beyond that. I trust and pray that that will happen in at least some modest ways in that process. Thank you for the time together. I've enjoyed it immensely. God bless you.